Welcome back, everyone, to episode 5 of Chasing Space. I'm your host, Brendan Swanek, joined by a super special guest today, Alex Coultrup. Alex, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you inviting me on, and I'm a fan of the episodes I've heard so far.
Sweet. Well, Alex has a really sweet role currently, and an even cooler past coming into this role as a young professional in the space industry. She started off her education at Orange Coast College in an aviation science program, earned AA, and prepared to transfer to FIT. While she was there, she did rowing team as well as the club, and then at FIT, studied undergraduate technical writing, transferred on the rowing scholarship. Alex, I didn't know you were a rower.
Yeah.
And went all the way up to the rowing world championships. It's pretty sweet. What position were you in the boat, just out of my own curiosity?
So I was bow seat in the lightweight women's quadruple scull. Are you very familiar with rowing, Brendan?
I'm not too familiar. My mom was a rower, and one of my best friends is a rower. So that's where I know it from.
Yeah. At OCC, Orange Coast is a community college in Southern California. And to my knowledge, it's the only community college in the country with a rowing team on the athletics program. That was a pretty cool and unique opportunity there.
Sweet. So into space and world-class rower, pretty serious combo. Beyond that, then went to FIT for your master's in spaceflight human factors, which I definitely want to talk to you about, with some grad research in human-centered design lab, working on IVA spacesuits, commercial-grade tours and vehicles, interior design. Pretty cool. Did you ever work with the company Tazi out in Seattle? I think they're working with a lot of different commercial space stations now to do that exact thing.
That is pretty cool, though. I love that. I don't know. There's just so much happening in the commercial side of the space industry that, what am I trying to say right now? Stuff that was formerly only research in academic institutions, there's entire business models around it now. And this is just one example, obviously. But yeah, pretty cool transition.
So on top of the master's, you also have multiple graduate certificates, one from ISU, which is International Space University, in global commercial space programs, essentially space entrepreneurship, space policy, and space systems. So every space sector. And then also MIT, so aerospace, aeronautical, and astronautical space engineering. What specifically was that certification?
Yeah, I want to be clear to not overhype this one. MIT has this great online platform that they call MITx, where some of their classes that they have recorded are available either for free or for some notional fee. So summer 2019, I enrolled in this MITx course, and it was a combination of recorded lectures from when Dr. Jeff Hoffman, who is a former astronaut who serviced and repaired the Hubble on shuttle flight STS-61, he teaches that class pretty regularly. So there were some archival lectures, but he also was available to grade our homework live throughout the semester. So having a background and an education that is not an engineering degree, I have tried to find opportunities to push myself to, take a class that will force me to learn a little more about the rocket equation. And I can get a little more into other ways I've tried to push myself to learn more in different areas outside my degree, maybe later on.
Sure. So the first question I do have for you is, undergrad, you did technical writing, and then master's, spaceflight human factors. So can you talk to me a little bit about when that transition happened?
Yeah, well, I think...
Or what, maybe a moment that you're like, wow, this is actually pretty cool. Like, I could get into this.
I think going back, I would do it differently. But when I was at my community college at OCC, I was in the aviation science program there. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a pilot. And I thought my career will be commercial airline pilot. That's what I'm going to do. And once I got into college and started taking all of the classes in the aviation science program, I really, really liked human factors. I liked the idea that there is an entire school of thought and an entire industry sector devoted to designing big, powerful, complex machines in a way that focuses on keeping humans safe and designing specifically to our unique capabilities and limitations. So when I was looking around for where am I going to transfer to complete my degree, I really wanted a university that had an aviation human factors master's program. And getting to your question about the comm degree in undergrad, it was because I knew I was transferring on a rowing scholarship. And for better or worse, the advice I had received was pick an easy major for undergrad, which is really oversimplifying the story, perhaps. But where my head was at when I was 19 and getting ready to transfer was, I'm going to remember what I learned in my aviation science program, do a great job, make rowing my job as an undergrad at Florida Tech, and then I'll be in the system and I will do the aviation human factors master's program. Anyways, long story short, Florida Tech is located in Melbourne, Florida, which is on the Space Coast region of Florida. So I could literally step into my driveway and watch a Falcon 9 go up. That's how proximity there works. I have seen more launches than I can count. But by the time I was wrapping up undergrad and getting ready for grad school, I was more interested in space than I was in aviation. Call it an artifact of the geography of the region. All of my friends were getting internships at NASA and SpaceX, and there was a big commercial space industry renaissance happening there, kind of post shuttle depression of the region.
Yeah.
So got into the aviation human factors master's program, got a great advisor, talked with them and said, I'm interested in space. Is space human factors even a thing? What can I do? And I was able to basically swap out a bunch of my electives. So instead of a class about, I don't know, the history of aviation law, instead maybe I take emerging issues in space policy. Or instead of a class where I'm learning all about the heavy G's that a fighter pilot pulls, I took human performance in microgravity. So just stuff like that. So it's technically aviation human factors degree, but I like to talk about my experience and what I learned as being really space human factors.
Because it sounds like you just spun it into what you wanted to learn.
Yeah, it's kind of a choose your own adventure. And I was very, very fortunate to have advisors and flexibility in the electives. And, Florida Tech had a lot of space classes that still satisfied my degree requirements, and I could do it that way. Not everyone has that.
That's awesome. And at that point, it seems like you are fully sold on the industry, because right then in 2020, the very first thing was you were in the Matthew Isakowitz Fellow. And for those that are listening that aren't familiar with that, that's probably one of the most prestigious distinguishments you can have as a young professional. It's a very close cohort. It's only like 200 fellows total, right? And I think they don't even accept anymore. So
yeah. The Matthew Isakowitz Fellowship Program was founded seven-ish years ago by the Isakowitz family in memory of Matthew Isakowitz, who was a young professional in commercial space who was very involved in very early stages of companies that we now think of as leaders in commercial space. SpaceX, Astronis, he did commercial space policy advocacy at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, got an engineering, space-focused degree at Princeton, I believe, and then later did his master's in commercial space policy at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. Anyways, he left quite a legacy, and the point of the fellowship is to identify and create opportunities for exceptional students and young professionals with demonstrated experience in commercial space. And I was very grateful to be accepted to the 2020 class. And the fellowship's goal from the beginning was to connect the fellows with internships and executive mentorship. So there's kind of a group of commercial space industry executives and leadership many of whom knew Matthew, who volunteer to be our mentors and, just be around for asking questions and developing our careers, which I think is a really unique resource, again, that not everyone has. And I try to do my best to be a resource like that for others although I'm only now starting to think of myself as someone who has the answers to other people's questions. But anyways, yeah, after 7 years, the fellowship just is now in its final year at a total of 200 fellows.
You're a match with XPRIZE, and I think XPRIZE is fascinating.
Yeah.
But most people aren't familiar with it. Could you just give a 1-2 punch on what XPRIZE is, and as your host company when you were going through this process as a fellow?
Yeah. Well, the idea is that you get matched with a commercial space company that's doing commercial space things. So XPRIZE is very famous for being an incentive prize organization that basically fundraises to create a prize purse, usually on the order of a couple $1 million, and then puts out these global competitions for who can solve a hard technical problem that we, the XPRIZE team, have identified as important for humanity's sustainable future. So I can't remember if it was the very first or one of the early prizes, but it was the suborbital spaceflight XPRIZE, where they wanted a commercial company to safely launch and land humans to space on a suborbital flight, twice within a very short period of time using the same vehicle. So I should have mentioned earlier, Matthew worked at XPRIZE early in his career.
Interesting.
And the leadership of XPRIZE includes Anusha Ansari, who is a commercial astronaut, although she was orbital, not suborbital. So anyways, XPRIZE remains a host company for the fellowship, although by the time I went there, none of the prizes were space-focused. But I was on the partnerships team, which I think was very fun, and I was able to I like to do creative problem solving in my day-to-day. And the idea of the partnerships team is teams with a great technical or engineering solution to the prize problems maybe need resources like a lab at a university to conduct their tests, or access to an open space for a robotics demonstration. And the partnerships team's role is to make those connections. Essentially, it was a business development role for XPRIZE.
Foreshadowing a little bit.
Yeah. Looking back at the time, I was like, dang, I wish I was more space focused in this internship placement. But looking back, I really got a lot of the skills that are helping me now. And I feel like I'm being a little more long-winded than your request for a 1-2 punch. But I was in the 2020 class, and I did start my internship in the first half of 2020. And because COVID-19 pandemic was kind of really ripping through the U.S. at the time, a lot of the other prizes that were underway, like the Wildfire Identification and Responses Prize and the Rainforest Biodiversity Survey Prize and the carbon capture stuff that was, just getting started, was either slowed or put on hold. And we focused on creating a series of rapid response mini prizes to solve problems that would help mitigate or treat COVID-19, like developing types of masks and supply chain stuff, bringing together researchers and medical professionals from different areas and backgrounds who wouldn't normally be able to collaborate. So it was kind of a crazy time to be there, but I enjoyed it.
And just looking at your timeline here, from the friends that I have that are part of this fellowship, the amount of people that you meet that do the coolest shit ever throughout the industry is unreal. And right after you did the Isakowitz Fellow, there's a timeline of a couple years where you started as a health and safety officer for analog astronaut research. And then the following year, you were officially an analog astronaut with a different organization. I think this is the coolest thing ever, especially since they just finished up the Mars simulated analog astronaut mission for 371 days, like a little over a year.
Yeah.
And a big 3D printed cement cabin inside JSC.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts about that. It is so cool. The people who were in there as analog astronauts for over a year, I mean, it's not easy.
No.
Even when you have like the best of resources at a NASA facility, which I imagine they did. But your question is,
I'm curious
these experiences.
Yeah, like what does it mean to be a health and safety officer? How do you even get into analog astronaut research, and what was it like? This is so fascinating to me to actually play the part of doing research to be an astronaut.
Yeah, so maybe just quick background for listeners who may not be familiar. The concept of an analog astronaut mission is the idea that there are things we can do here on Earth to simulate living in the space environment, more or less closely, because they are very different environments, to try to learn best practices, to understand what certain risks and hazards are. And when I say we, I mean NASA and sovereign space agencies, as well as, now companies that may wish to provide training for future commercial astronauts, and then academic institutions as well. So there are a handful of these so-called analog stations in different regions around the world, and they're usually constructed in areas that we think of as like, oh, this looks like Mars, this looks like the moon, it is remote and desolate, and there's not any plants growing here. So the first analog mission that I went on, they were very different from each other. The first one was at the Mars Desert Research Station, which is a metal cylinder sitting in the middle of the desert in Utah.
No kidding.
And it is owned and operated by the Mars Society. The Mars Society is I want to say nonprofit, and it was founded by Dr. Robert Zubrin, who listeners may be familiar with his book, The Case for Mars, which recommended reading for sure. But anyways, the idea of Mars Desert Research Station, MDRS, is that you can put together a crew and apply. If you have a research agenda, the Mars Society folks who run their analog program will review your research agenda, ask you some safety questions. We had to, fill out a bunch of paperwork the same way you might if you were proposing research as a grad student. And then essentially go and live there for 2 weeks, following a lot of rules to be like, okay, we're on Mars now, we're not on Earth, and we're not going to step outside this, habitat without our spacesuits on, or, we can, the type of food we have access to is very constrained because we couldn't load up our rocket to Mars with, more mass than the payload allowance, that type of thing. So you're really kind of, we call it being in simulation. You have to really commit to the bit, as it were. But the way that I got involved in this was actually through the fellowship. There were a couple of folks who were already friends through the Matthew Isakowitz Fellowship, and decided, wouldn't it be cool if we could get a group of fellows, to put together a research agenda and go do a simulated astronaut mission and pretend we're living on Mars and see if we can learn something. In the end, kind of due to COVID and other delays, it ended up being 50-50 space industry friends and space industry friends from the fellowship. But
that's awesome.
I really enjoyed it. And we all kind of, this one was self-funded. And we did some fundraising and chipped in from savings and stuff, but created our own research agenda, and we volunteered for different roles. So we had a guy who was our botanist. We had a girl with a background in biology who said, I'm going to be the crew scientist. I had my background in human factors, so I decided maybe I'll do a safety audit of the station and some ergonomics research and some psychology research. So I'll be the health and safety officer. And we also tried to think, how are we going to set up our day and the schedule and the cadence, and what other roles around the habitat do we delegate to each other? What is our leadership structure? What are the best practices that they use on the International Space Station for tasks like this? So that was that first mission.
It's so fascinating how much research can come out of an analog mission. Like I got curious. So I pulled up the habitat floor plan. Looks like it's only 26 meters or 26 feet in diameter. Yeah. Not big. How many people were in there? Was it 6?
Mm-hmm.
6 people, a really small upper deck, an engineering airlock. So it just seems like there's just so much to learn about how people operate in closed spaces, and then how the space contours to the amount of people in there.
I mean, the design is all very clever, right? It's like living in a tiny home, and the shape and size and form factor and interior design of MDRS in particular all comes from The Case for Mars, Dr. Zubrin's book.
No kidding.
Yeah, you can read
Case
the
for
Wikipedia
Mars.
page on this, but he proposed a long time ago a plan for getting to Mars called Mars Direct, which involved essentially converting the upper stage of the vehicle into the habitat, which is why it's a cylinder about the size of a large rocket fairing, a very large rocket fairing. But, you know, there's historically have been two schools of thought about what are humans going to do in the solar system after Leo. Right now, NASA is on the Artemis program, which proposes returning to the moon, establishing permanent presence there, learning a lot, and using it as a launch pad to get to Mars. Dr. Zubrin's proposal was Mars Direct, skipping over the moon. But that's a whole nother
Yep.
a whole nother conversation.
It is interesting because I think the Starship is just under 30 meters or 30 feet. I keep doing that. 30 feet in diameter. So maybe he's got a point. Yeah. So I know that there was a role that you had in between the two analog positions. Do you mind chatting about the experience of actually being an analog astronaut?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll first say that this is not like a full-time job. Mm-hmm. This is something that I requested 2 weeks of PTO to go do. And I was actually employed at Nanoracks at the time. And Jeff Manber, being the awesome commercial space industry person that he is, very enthusiastically gave me that time off. So that was very nice. And I will say, well, would you like a summary of the other mission or straight into the experience?
Whatever you think tells the story the best, because it seems like you're one of those people that are able to like have your day job, but also really continue to hammer what's interesting to you. So however you think the story like best plays itself, because I know they're all happening around the same time.
That's true. It does become a little harder to balance pursuing like personal interests and what I call extracurricular research. I think as I've seen myself getting a little more along my career path, just because work becomes more demanding or there's, a lot of things taking up time or money. But I really enjoyed and was fascinated by the analog experience. So when I saw a government-funded study kind of jointly run by NASA and DARPA, when I saw the opportunity to apply to join this mission, I, of course, filled out the paperwork. And this one was a little more, if my first mission was very ad hoc and we kind of threw it together as a friend group and did our best to brainstorm a research agenda and keep on schedule, this other one was very, very rigorous. This other habitat that I went to is called High Seas, which stands for, I want to get it right, Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation. And this one is, a geodesic dome, essentially, set on the top of a mountain at about 8,000 feet above sea level on Mauna Loa, on the big island of Hawaii. And they did specifically as a lunar simulation, which, effectively, it's only different than a Mars simulation if you play by different rules, right? And so, one of the different rules we played by was we had a shorter communications delay with ground control, right? Rather than the communications delay we enforced on ourselves when we were on Mars. But this was a 4-week simulated lunar surface mission. And unlike my first mission where I was with people I knew and we had been planning the research agenda for months and working together and cooperating on weekly Zoom calls to work out all the details. On this one, the research that they wanted to do was deliberately to see how people would perform under high pressure with strangers. So I did not know any of the other 5 crew members prior to entering the simulation.
Interesting.
And there's still some NDAs in place because they're, finalizing the research and they haven't published the findings yet, to my knowledge, although I haven't checked their website in a while. But what I can say is that we had an extremely rigorous work schedule. There were psychological experiments where we had to take tests over and over as in theory our performance was expected to get worse throughout the mission. We were going on 3-hour EVAs, extravehicular activity, or spacewalks 3 times a week, wearing these heavy suits and communicating over a comms thing and navigating by GPS. And we were going out there and taking measurements of geology formations and they were all like pretend tasks for us to do, but simulated after, research that we anticipate crews on the surface of the moon might do in the future. So a lot of mapping, a lot of, looking for specimens or specific minerals type of thing.
Was there anything during the analog mission that was unexpected that you didn't think would be an issue, or something that was much more pleasant than you anticipated?
I found myself, as someone who's normally like very even-tempered and maybe not go with the flow, but I get along with people.
Yeah.
I found myself having a very short temper in like week 3 and 4 of the 1-month mission. And I found myself getting annoyed with my crewmates about things that I absolutely would not get annoyed with them about on Earth. And I think it's so interesting because traditionally, NASA astronauts and, astronauts trained by sovereign space agencies, they do train on the ground with each other for years before they fly. Everyone knows each other. You have time to work out your differences and like figure out how to get along with people well before you launch into space. And that was kind of more what my friends and I did when we created our mission at MDRS. And then in the future, we might see commercial astronauts who are scientists and researchers, or people with a technical role who work at companies on Earth, who get sent on a 1-week business trip to a commercial space station by their company to go perform some experiment. And they're all living together in a contained environment and they don't know each other. And that was more the experience I had in my second simulation. And I think just like when resources are constrained and you can't get away from people and you don't know each other very well, so it's hard to know how much constructive feedback you can give each other. And everyone wants to get along. It's really easy, I think, to find something like if I had just communicated something I found annoying or something where I have a different preference for how we execute a certain task. If I had had the courage to communicate with a crewmate about it earlier in the mission, I wouldn't be then getting annoyed about something that I could have prevented weeks and weeks later. And I think that's a big lesson learned for me personally, that I could probably take into the real world as well.
It is interesting because I wonder how applicable that experience would be for a group of, let's just take Axiom's PAM missions, for example, and let's just say they didn't train for months beforehand. Like, let's just say it was a steady business model with the Axiom or station or whomever gets up there first, and these folks meet each other and then just go straight up. I wonder how much more applicable the high seas research would be going in and not knowing them, because I can imagine spending, a couple weeks inside of a tin can that's 1,200 square feet. I would find myself getting short-tempered too.
And it's so funny, right? Because people go camping all the time and you're like in the middle of nowhere with like dehydrated food with a small group, and people, live on submarines and do their research, or live in Antarctica and, do their astronomy or whatever other types of research they're doing. So analog space missions are not unique in their ability to isolate people in an extreme environment, right? I think what makes them unique is the idea that we are playing by different rules. We are pretending that there is a vacuum outside and there's nowhere to put our waste except for maybe recycling some of it. Or in particular, the mission in which I was essentially a guinea pig test subject in this 4-week study, their objective was to push us physically and psychologically to exhaustion and then beyond, and see how our behavior would change. And we also had to wear some biomonitoring devices so they can kind of link our behavior with physical markers as well. And hopefully layers of information stacked up like that across, they ran 6 iterations of this mission. So 6 different crews did it. It was a 6-month study, or more, including gaps. Hopefully that's a good data set for learning how we can detect early warnings of, someone needs to have a break but instead of going on this particular EPA, or I don't know, hopefully it'll be helpful for health and safety in long duration missions in the future.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh. So this is all on top of what you're doing for your job.
Yes.
So we started with Nanoracks, and I know your technical role was business development, but I have a hunch that you wore a lot of hats when you were with Nanoracks. Can you talk a little bit about what you did there? Because I know there was a lot of policy research. There's a lot of proposal writing to NASA grants, which is not the easiest thing in the world and is very tricky to master. So can you talk a little bit about your time at Nanoracks?
Yeah, absolutely. So first I will say I love Nanoracks. And I think like the history of what that team has built and the way that we today in 2024 think about what flying an experiment to space looks like is, due not all, but mostly to a lot of the work that Nanoracks, especially their leadership, Jeff Mamber, has put into understanding the business case and the business models that exist in space, et cetera, et cetera. And like, that's a lot of what you're doing day to day there now. And I would say a core and like highly recognizable part of Nanoracks' business is we help people fly payloads to space and get their experiments to space, whether it's a small business or an academic institution or, what have you, nonprofit. But there are also other things going on, which is more what I was a part of. So on the BizDev team, I specifically supported a program that at the time was called Outpost. And the idea was to figure out how to convert spent upper stages of rockets into long duration platforms that could live on as essentially controllable mini space stations where we could do research or, starting to get very sci-fi as we try to think of the future,
wow.
Right? Is there a way to clean them out and make them safe for human habitability? Or, use them as building blocks for other useful parts of space infrastructure in the future. Of course, you can't get to a sci-fi future without doing like little one step at a time type of building blocks. So when I was on the Outpost program, we focused a lot on what will it take just to bring the upper stage back to life, right? What will it take to, host a payload on there in the future? So I did write a lot of proposals, and I will say that is something that I still use in my day-to-day at my current job, and it is such an underrated skill, I think, in the space industry. So maybe it's a good thing that I have a technical writing degree in undergrad. But it was actually Mike Lewis of Nanoracks who taught me how to write proposals to NASA and to other organizations in the government. And my best advice for writing proposals to win government contracts is remember that the reviewer, the person who's going to read your proposal and make an award recommendation and score your proposal, is a person. And that person has to review a zillion proposals just like yours. So anything you can do to make your reviewer's life easier while still complying with all of the boxes you need to check to be qualified. Anything you can do to help the reviewer is good. I love to do a little storytelling. Why are we proposing this? What's the point? What is the envisioned future? And that's a tip I learned from Jeff, who told me that my proposals were too boring at the beginning, and I needed to use my creative writing skills to give a compelling reason why the government should care about funding this research.
My impression would be that when you're writing a proposal, it's going to be as technical as possible and try to keep pathos out of it. Like there shouldn't be emotion in it, but it sounds like the latter is actually true. Like you really need to enthrall whoever's reading this to be impassioned by why you should win the reward. Is that kind of the takeaway?
It's a balance, of course. You want to do your technical diligence and be extremely clear about what you're going to build and why, and like why your company and your team is credible. I guess I was mostly talking about like the hook at the beginning.
Got it.
I used to just dive right in to the proposed innovation, as it is called in the proposal outlines. And now I try to kind of set the stage, give a little history, company name here envisions a future where we're doing all of these cool things in space. What does that unlock? What does that enable? Okay, in order to get to it, we need this capability. Next paragraph. The proposed innovation that we're seeking funding for is, and then you dive into getting as technically sharp as you possibly can and, following all the government's rules for what to include in the proposal. In addition to the Outpost program, something else that I was really, am really happy that I worked on at Nanoracks and had the opportunity was the proposal for Starlab. And for those who don't know, Starlab is the proposed commercial space station that Nanoracks is working on with Voyager, and there's, a whole group of teammates working on to bring that space station to life. But I remember when NASA put out the solicitation for CLD, Commercial LEO Destinations, as a program, and I was excited to be on the team. I don't know, something so ambitious, and I had studied human performance in space in the past, but hadn't really worked on any human habitability projects to date in my professional career. So I only wrote certain portions of the proposal. I will not take credit for the whole thing. It was an incredibly heavy lift, a huge effort, and the person who was in charge of my team did a great job of keeping us all on track and keeping us organized and understanding the requirements. But I remember having projects to support it, let's figure out how much volume we need to give the astronauts so they can live and work comfortably. How many overlapping functional spaces can fit into one module with these, physical size constraints type of thing. And as I said, I had written some small proposals for small dollar government contract awards in the past. But being a small part of something that was really, really big, that was a first for me, and it's something I still think about in my career today. Because at Starfish, the company I work at now, which we'll talk about later, we're graduating out of those small dollar government contracts and into, hopefully bigger and better and more exciting things. And I think I am taking a lot of lessons learned from that into my day-to-day now. And just to see that commercial space stations are not science fiction, and hopefully they'll be coming online in LEO maybe within the decade, is pretty cool to see. And I just am always following the news about Starlab, and any new announcement and what they're doing on that team is just so cool to keep track of, along with the other commercial LEO destinations in the mix as well. So,
well, you must be so pumped because now they're partnered with Northrop Grumman, MDA Space, Palantir, Airbus, and they already have their ride up there.
My
first
God.
Starship dedicated ride. So, I mean,
yeah, it's so cool.
Talk about how far it's came since you worked on it.
Yeah, every press release, every announcement, I am there. I'm the biggest cheerleader. I'm hitting awesome. On LinkedIn. Yeah. So, yeah, Sweet. Just overall a very, very awesome project to feel like I played some small role there.
So you did a lot of things at Nanoracks. You learned a lot, and it's the interesting connection that I'm thinking of now is I feel like your brain was already sort of shifted towards the thought of reusability and extended life for spacefaring objects.
Yeah.
So then following Nanoracks, you then joined Starfish Space, which I believe, was it founded less than 3 or 4 years ago?
Just about 4 years ago in October 2018.
And you have been in charge of low Earth orbit, business, and policy. So your title is Director of LEO Business and Policy, which again, seems like you may have more than one role. So before we talk about everything that you're doing there, can you just talk to us a little bit about what Starfish Space is for those that aren't familiar, and then what on-orbit servicing means? Because these are very new terms.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you described, I've been with Starfish Space for about 2.5 years. I joined in Q1 of 2022. And as you said, wearing many different hats. It's been really fun and kind of scary, kind of exciting, as probably anyone who works at a startup knows, to see the company grow from a very small team. I think we were less than 15 people when I joined, to scaling very rapidly. And now we're at 70-ish people, I believe.
Wow.
So that's been very fun. And it's interesting because there are entire teams now dedicated to, something that used to be a side project for me that I would, I volunteered to do it. because we didn't have anyone else to do it at the company at the beginning. And all of my colleagues have seen that happen. And it's an exercise in being able to let go and being able to delegate. Because I loved contributing to so many different areas at once, which I'm absolutely still doing. So,
total startup vibes.
Oh my gosh, exactly. So the reason my title is Leo Business and Policy is, this is something we skipped over actually in my background, is when I was in grad school, I had an internship in DC, the first time I came to DC, as a aerospace security policy, space security policy researcher at a major think tank here in DC.
Cool.
So kind of have a background in space policy, took a couple of space policy classes in grad school, which is why I got excited enough to apply to this particular internship. And I learned so much there, and it's almost 5 years ago now. But for a while, as someone who was based in DC at a company where everyone else is in Seattle and who had a background in policy, I was raising my hand and saying, anytime a policy-related matter comes up, I will be the one to interact with that project and do the work for Starfish. And there are open questions in the world of policy about the work that we want to do. And I think the commercial industry is really coming together to solve those questions and to get answers, because the capabilities we're building at Starfish Space are new. In-space servicing as a commercial offering is not something that has historically existed, in the in-space economy.
Definitely not.
So I feel like I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So I'll go back to your question. What is Starfish Space? What are we doing? So Starfish Space is a satellite servicing company. That means that we are building our spacecraft, which is called the Otter, and you're going to get a bunch of cute nautical names for our vehicle and its components. We're building the Otter to autonomously rendezvous and dock with other spacecraft in orbit, and then move them from here to there, like a tow truck. And I think it's a very interesting capability because you can unlock a lot of different use cases, depending on how you choose to apply it. But I will say our two major commercial offerings are in GEO, life extension, and in LEO, debris removal and disposal. And I should define my terms here. GEO is geosynchronous orbit. Maybe I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with this, but it's called geosynchronous because from a physics perspective, there is some altitude at which the satellite moves at the same speed that the Earth rotates. So a satellite placed in GEO appears to be hovering in a fixed point in the sky. What that means is GEO is the most valuable real estate in space, or it has been historically. Maybe some of the LEO providers would beg to differ. And then LEO is low Earth orbit, which I think we're all very familiar with.
So I know that you guys have been blowing up recently. You've had recent deals with U.S. Space Systems Command. You had one with Intelsat for another satellite servicing mission. And I know that your tech demonstration satellite, OtterPup, had some pretty incredible feats in 2023 with the deorbit satellite. Do you mind talking about that real quick?
Our first two Otter missions are now spoken for at Starfish. We signed a contract with the Space Force, and they have an office focus on the mission area called SML, Servicing Mobility and Logistics. And that mission is for us to build and launch and fly an Otter and rendezvous and dock with a U.S. Space Force asset in GEO and perform some docked maneuver with that spacecraft. And I won't say anything more about the con ops there. And then our second contract, also to build an Otter, fly, rendezvous, and dock with an Intelsat spacecraft up in GEO. And I think we love the big Space Force contract. And that's a $37.5 million deal through a contracting vehicle called StratFi, Strategic Financing Increase, which is kind of like what every startup would love to get to after kind of moving through the different phases of the SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Funding Program. Mm-hmm. I am so excited about the Intelsat mission for a couple reasons. One, this is what we want to see. We want the technologies that Starfish Space is bringing to bear to live in the commercial world. You know, there's this idea, which is true, that so much space technology is dual use. It can serve commercial needs, it can serve government needs, and that does give us, you know, some redundancy in our business plan, right? It's good to serve so many different types of clients. I just find commercial so exciting personally. Intelsat is one of the biggest, baddest legacy telecom operators in GEO. They have a pretty robust fleet of spacecraft that provide connectivity all around the world. And those spacecraft have been doing a great job providing connectivity services for years and years and years and years. In the space industry, as you know, so much of our hardware is so over-engineered to survive for a really long time because space is such a harsh environment, especially when you get out to GEO. There's some pretty extreme radiation to deal with, not only on the way there, but once you're parked.
Yeah, rad hardening all your components.
Yeah.
Crazy.
So much of these vehicles are so over-engineered that they can actually survive and continue performing their commercial service for much longer than originally scoped or than their, you know, initial lifetime as it was designed. So what a lot of spacecraft operators in GEO are running into is our revenue-generating payload works just fine. We did a great job building this revenue-generating payload. The problem is our spacecraft has lived so long, it doesn't have fuel anymore. It's out of propellant. So that's where Starfish Space comes in. One of the variables that spacecraft in GEO have to deal with is because of the shape of the Earth and the existence of other masses in the solar system and solar weather and things like this, solar wind, and a myriad of other perturbations that I won't get into now. Spacecraft in GEO tend to drift out of their slot. And if they have to stay in one slot in order to perform their services and give their connectivity to the ground, because they're designed to be hovering in that fixed spot over the Earth's surface. Everyone who has a satellite dish on top of their house has it just pointing at that spot in space. So even if their revenue-generating payload still works, if that satellite drifts too far out of its designated box, whether that's east-west or up and down in inclination, they can no longer make money. So what we can do with the Otter is rendezvous with their spacecraft and use our fuel to essentially pull them back into their box and keep them there for however many years, the contract specifies. So that's what we're doing with Intelsat. And Intelsat has a legacy as the first ever adopter of commercial satellite servicing services, not from Starfish, but from Northrop Grumman Space Logistics with their MEV vehicle. MEV, the Mission Extension Vehicle, was the first to ever do it. And we think that is so cool, and they paved the way by docking with an Intelsat vehicle in 2019 and performing the exact type of station-keeping service I just described. So that makes Starfish the second ever provider in history. So that is pretty exciting.
And for those listening, I had the opportunity to see Alex and a senior fellow at Northrop Grumman chat about this at the MIT New Space Age conference, and it was pretty cool to have them both up there at the same time because there's a lot of legacy knowledge from Northrop and a lot of really cool new tech from Starfish. So really paving the way here.
Yeah. Oh, mad respect for their team. Yeah.
I think the LEO portion is also super interesting because if you ask anybody the question of sustainability in space, the first thing they're going to say is space debris. And I know that some of these pieces of debris are massive. There was like a 2.9 ton pallet of nickel hydrogen batteries from the ISS. I think there's an 8-ton satellite that died up there somewhere. So a school bus cruising around. And this is the area that you're specifically focused on is LEO. Is the technology, besides rad hardening and maybe some additional propulsion and additional mass, how much different is the Otter in LEO versus GEO?
Yeah, I guess I've just been talking about GEO this whole time because that's where our first two contracts are. But as you said,
okay, got it. That's good context.
I am the director of LEO business, so I spend more of my time, if not most of my time, thinking about our business case in LEO. So happy to get into that. I will say that part of our business model is we have one vehicle. It's called the Otter. And there's a GEO variant that's slightly more rad hardened, right? And like can tolerate that environment, and the LEO variant. But at the end of the day, the Otter is the Otter, and it's the same vehicle that we're building. Really makes things smooth and easy for us on the supply chain side. And we only have one production line, which is a different strategy than other satellite servicing companies that are offering services in both LEO and GEO. Some of these other companies have two different vehicles that they manufacture. But so what I will say is maybe some differences between the Otter and other offerings on the market. One of our key advantages is our Otter has a fully electric propulsion architecture. And what is electric propulsion? What does that mean? Why does it matter? So in the field of in-space propulsion, there's several different varieties, but the two biggest categories are chemical propulsion and electric propulsion. So ChemProp and EP, as I like to call them. ChemProp is a high thrust propulsion option, meaning you can go from 0 to 60 really fast. So you have high agility, quick response time, things like that. But with chemical propulsion, your trade-off is low efficiency. Your fuel doesn't last long. And so if you want a satellite with a very long lifespan, or that can continuously maneuver throughout its life, or provide maneuver services to others, you have to bring a ton of volume and a ton of mass with you, which really costs you a lot on launch and even on manufacture of your vehicle. Electric propulsion is just the opposite. It's very low thrust, so you cannot move extremely fast, but it's very high efficiency, which means that in a very small volume and a very low mass, I can have enough fuel to last, not forever, but a very long time, which means that for a satellite that wants to maneuver to have the same amount of delta V on board, which is aerospace industry shorthand for fuel in the tank, essentially. It stands for change in velocity. How much delta V can I have on board? With a chemical propulsion vehicle, you need a big, fat spacecraft. And with an electric propulsion vehicle that has the exact same amount of delta V, you can do it in a little guy. So that's what we're doing at Starfish. That's why Otter is an ESPA-class spacecraft, not very big at all, under 500 kilograms in mass, which is also a novel approach to satellite servicing. With the MEV that we were describing a moment ago, that's a big spacecraft to service a big spacecraft. And they're about the same size and mass as each other, maybe on the order of 3,000 kilograms. With the Otter, it's, an under 500 kilogram spacecraft to service that 3,000 kilogram client. So that also helps us pass some savings along to our customers. Okay, finally getting into LEO.
I think the context is important, though, because all these different parts are a reason why Starfish is winning these contracts and doing so well, because you're doing this in a unique way. So I think the context is killer.
Oh, hell yeah. Thank you. The work that I do in LEO is, just like anyone else in business development, go talk to commercial users and ask the question, what are your pain points? What do you need? How could a service like this be useful for you? No one is going to pay for something that doesn't give them a benefit. So the only time paying for satellite servicing makes sense, and this applies in both LEO and GEO, is when it increases your bottom line or gives you some benefit, whether that's safety, whether that is increased confidence in your operations, aka safety, or additional years of revenue. So the key offering in LEO, again, autonomously docking, rendezvousing and docking with a spacecraft and moving it somewhere. That moving it somewhere in LEO usually looks like end-of-life disposal assistance. Why is that important in LEO? First of all, I mentioned earlier, there's the speed of the spacecraft that it travels around the Earth varies by altitude. In LEO, things are moving much, much faster than they are in GEO. These spacecraft are just zipping by each other, which is why you were mentioning earlier, collision risk is so, has such extreme consequences. Mm-hmm. I could have a speck of paint, hit some large metallic object, because it's moving so fast, correct me on the number here, but 7,000 meters per second. That is going to result in like 1 million pieces of shrapnel spread all over the place. So in LEO, there are operators now who are moving toward what we call proliferated architectures, aka very large constellations. And this is a way to compete in the telecom market that has traditionally been dominated by GEO, which is a whole nother conversation about now there's competition in GEO, or for the services GEO provides that maybe previously that competition didn't exist or was negligible. Because spacecraft in LEO need to move so fast to maintain orbit, they're not hovering over one patch of ground for a long time. They're constantly moving over the horizon, and in the case of a very large constellation, being replaced with the next satellite in the chain. And it takes an entire network of, depending on your altitude and your configuration, hundreds or thousands of satellites working in concert to give global coverage. That's why we see these large constellations coming online. The advantage is extremely low latency, which consumers on the ground want, and reliable coverage as the satellites hand off the service to each other as they zip around. The disadvantage is if you are flying your entire constellation at the same altitude, distributed in just a few inclinations with intersecting planes, even one spacecraft drifting slightly out of its pre-coordinated dance can pose an existential risk to the entire rest of your constellation. So what we propose is, again, everything in space, many things in space are over-engineered, and these satellites last a long time. Mm-hmm. Say you have a large constellation of thousands of birds flying. If even 1, 2, or 3 of them fall derelict and start drifting away, or, become a piece of debris that the rest of your 997 satellites have to dodge, that's a huge cost in terms of propellant and collision avoidance. And in the event that you get it wrong, a collision in your particular band, your altitude and inclination band, wipes out the entire rest of this infrastructure that you just invested a bunch of money building and launching and operating. So our proposal is, maybe we don't know how many will fail, but statistically some will. And I wish it wasn't the case. But what we can do at Starfish is use the Otter to dock with whichever one of those spacecraft is becoming troublesome for our friends at Anonymous Leo Corporation, and just pull that one satellite out of the way and dispose of it at the end of its life. And because it has fallen derelict, it's no longer able to dispose of itself. So by paying Starfish Space some notional fee on demand per a couple of disposals, what you can do is save a bunch on collision avoidance and have the confidence to operate the entire rest of your constellation longer, push that constellation of the remaining healthy satellites beyond its original planned performance time, push it to its breaking point, and get X number of additional revenue years times, let's say notionally 997 more satellites per year. So we've found that there is appetite for that, more and more so as constellation size increases. So that's a lot of what's going on in LEO. And I will say that another service that I was excited to see a lot of Earth observation companies might be interested in is there are cases when Earth observation operators want to fly their satellites lower to get, fly their satellites nice and low to get good resolution. But then you're suffering from atmospheric drag. And it is sometimes the case that that maybe the spacecraft is decaying and will burn up in the atmosphere much sooner than the revenue-generating observation payload would fail. So if only there were a solution to dock with my satellite and give it an altitude boost, again, I could operate for several more years and get increased revenue from that same system instead of having to replace it. Replacing spacecraft in LEO is increasingly attractive to operators, just as the cost of building and launching a spacecraft has come down. But I think companies are still eager to delay or defer that cost, or maybe if schedule has slipped on the ground and the replacement they're building isn't ready yet. Bringing in the otter to maneuver their existing spacecraft to fill that gap is useful both in LEO, in the way I just described, and in GEO, of course, which is the core of the life extension mission. Whew. That was a long monologue.
You killed it. I've one last little technical question about the feature of, or the act of docking.
Mm-hmm.
So I know MEV did it first. How does Starfish plan to dock to existing spacecraft? Because, in my head, a lot of these spacecraft were around before Starfish existed. And I know some may have a universal separating that they use that a lot of different companies use, but how will Otter actually dock to these spacecraft?
How will Otter actually dock? That is a very good and valid question. And as you can imagine, we have gotten that question from our commercial customers, both the ones who are public and who are not public right now. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we are able to, people are trusting us with their satellites, right? They're very expensive birds that they have built and cost them a lot of money. And we are asking them to trust us that we can approach these objects that are moving very fast and dock with them in a way that is safe and does not result in a collision, and a breakup. I want to tie this to the concept of first principles problem solving, which is kind of a buzzword in the aerospace industry. It's a big thing at SpaceX. But I think it's a really good approach to solving technical problems, I guess, and business problems. First principles problem solving just says, don't take any assumptions for granted, break down your question to, what you're actually trying to solve, and be creative in coming up with a solution that is perhaps a more straightforward path. I think there are two schools of thought, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but for the point of this thought exercise, I'll refer to them as mutually exclusive. Two schools of thought about what it takes to dock a satellite. One school of thought is, let's install some hardware prior to launch so that docking hardware, call it side A, is available on the spacecraft, so that when my servicing vehicle comes up 5, 7, 15 years later with side B, they're guaranteed to dock with each other, and we know the shape and size of them, and we have like a garage to park in, essentially. We have a parking spot
sure.
on the satellite. What are the pros of that is we've tested the connection on the ground in this way, and it's two sides that were designed to be compatible. The cons are you're asking a customer who hopes their satellite isn't going to fail, doesn't know if it will, may or may not need satellite servicing 5, 10, 15 years in the future. You are asking them to make engineering design changes on the ground, add mass and complexity to their spacecraft prior to launch, and pay all of that up front, which is especially challenging in LEO, when the whole point is that out of 1,000 satellites, maybe 2 or 3 will ever even need servicing. Okay, so that's one school of thought. The school of thought we have at Starfish is there are satellites in space today that need servicing, and it's up to us to find a way to dock with them, no matter if they have pre-configured interfaces or not. And I will say, it is really cool to see that there is adoption of pre-configured docking interfaces in the commercial market. Like, for example, OneWeb has installed the dog tag mag tag feature, which is like a flat plate with a fiducial marking for visual reference on board all of their spacecraft, which is so cool. Not everyone has done that, though, right? So the approach we've taken at Starfish is asking ourselves, okay, what does it take to dock with an unprepared client so that we can start performing services now and therefore making revenue now? Mm-hmm. Realistically, what we've done is interact and build trust with operators in commercial space, in LEO and GEO, and get a deep understanding of what their spacecraft look like and what features are common across many spacecraft. and then simply design an interface on the ground and test it with a representative mock-up of the identified features.
Interesting.
And then put it on the otter. Obviously, there's more that goes into it than that. And I will say, back to my proposal writing expertise, is we have, I'm very glad and very grateful that we received government contracts to just continue augmenting the design and do the research and test the capture dynamics of this docking interface that we call Nautilus in some of the most high fidelity motion simulation. What is it like to bring two objects together in space type of laboratories that exist on Earth? And we've been able to test that Nautilus docking mechanism against representative surfaces that we know exist on spacecraft in GEO and in LEO at scale. Our customers who have signed contracts with us have a high degree of confidence that the tests we've performed on the ground are representative of what the capture dynamics will look like in space, and they're willing for us to go and dock with their spacecraft. And you mentioned Otter Pup. We do have an in-space docking demonstration coming up, launching in the coming months, to hopefully dock with another commercially owned and operated satellite.
All right.
To demonstrate the capability in LEO in 2025.
Alex, you've had an incredible career so far, from 2 analog astronaut missions, 2 different roles, one as a director as a young professional, and a whole boatload of experience in a massive network in space. You're killing it. What is one piece of advice that you would give to someone that would love to be in a position like you're in?
Oh my gosh. One piece of advice.
Only one, hitting you with the heavy hitters.
Okay. The advice is be willing to be uncomfortable. And I don't mean like interpersonally, there's creepy, aerospace guys who are being unprofessional. No, yeah. I don't mean that. For me, what being uncomfortable has looked like is I took a spacecraft design for the radiation environment class in grad school when I didn't have to, because I thought it'll probably benefit me in the future to at least have a working knowledge of this area. And then I encountered some equations that were really hard for me. And for me, being uncomfortable looks like my startup has a new project that it's really exciting and someone has to program manage it, except for she's out on maternity leave. Okay, I will do it. And I'm happy to be the dumbest person in the room of all of my colleagues who are on the engineering design team for this project, and learn through exposure to them and asking them questions that they've probably explained to someone else already. And I think something else that's important is, like to the point of being uncomfortable, is sometimes working longer hours to achieve something. And not to say that work-life balance doesn't matter, because it so does. But like, for example, I was working full-time, and I was in grad school, and I was in DC for my internship, and I stayed up late and wrote my proposal for the Matthew Isakowitz Fellowship to apply for the fellowship, right? I don't know, like there are some things that it is worth working longer hours to do,
While you have the time and the energy and the bandwidth.
Yeah, it's so hard to be like, being uncomfortable is the key, because that's not the key to everything. Yeah, you have to watch out for your mental health as well, and remove yourself from some situations. It's important to know that balance, but it's easy to surprise ourselves, like if we're willing to put yourself out there.
I totally agree. I think especially in your early career, saying yes to things, even if they seem weird or annoying, or you have to work a little bit longer, tend to be the ones that pay off in dividends.
Absolutely. It's about increasing your surface area. That's how good luck happens.
Yeah.
You prepare
make it more
for good
probable
luck.
To have good luck.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. And for everyone that wants to see what Alex does in her future, because it's definitely not going to be shy of awesome, you can find her definitely on LinkedIn. Her last name is spelled Coultrup. If you want to learn a little bit more about Starfish Space, you can go to starfishspace.com or find it through Alex's LinkedIn, I'm sure. Alex, seriously, thanks again for coming on here and chatting. This has been awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. This was super fun.
And for everyone listening, if you have the time, please give this a 5-star rating and review if you did enjoy it. You can find this on any podcast player, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, you name it. And Alex, we'll catch up soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Brendan.